flow and everything else. So, so rather than sort of show, you know, an 18-minute interview, Sam and I really distilled it down to a sort of a talking point. So I wanted to present that video first, and then we can post some questions and kind of keep this open-ended. This isn't going to be just a talking head here. I really want to engage the audience and you know, get people's questions as we go. So let me just share screen here. Okay. All right, so here's the video. Oh.
Hi, my name is Michael Froio, and I'm excited to be sharing my ongoing project from the main line. My work in general tends to center around things of a historical nature. I draw on history, the landscape itself, the built environment, and architecture. This project, From the Main Line, examines the evolution of transportation and industrial history spanning some 250 years, before, during, and after the existence of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So for me, it's about looking at that landscape and understanding all the history and all the complexities that came along with that. And the railroad is literally sort of the theme that weaves you through that landscape. I started introducing more research into the process and looking at different historical narratives and different themes that I was sort of discovering in the photographs after the fact. And that kind of led me down a path of using research more to inform my work. Engineering drawings, old maps, old photographs, visual ephemera. One, it can inform me on the state of this railroad, when it was hitting its peak, when it was becoming one of the biggest corporations in the world. And two, visualizing that landscape and that railroad in the American scene at the turn of the century. I'm very excited to show at the first annual 2020 Photo Festival at Gravy Studios. History Inspires Contemporary is a perfect sort of theme for my work as a whole, where I tend to gravitate towards things of a historic nature, and I tend to photograph subjects that are contemporary in their own right, but draw from historical narratives.
Okay, well, so let me just get this, sorry, I'm gonna just put up my website while we kind of talk a little bit. So Katie, did you want to kind of kick off with a couple of questions while we sort of get people engaged? You there? I can't.
Sorry, I muted myself.
Oh, there you are. All right. Okay.
Sorry, this is my first Zoom. How did you get started with this project?
The mainline project started with, sorry, I'm just trying to get Zoom up so I can see what's going on here. The mainline project started back in 2000, oh man, maybe 2009. And so it was basically, I had done a couple of projects sort of post-college. I graduated in 2001 from Drexel. And there were two projects that, you know, one kind of focused on the landscape along the Delaware River, and the other project started with the demolition of the Philadelphia Civic Auditorium, and then went into several other big sort of public buildings in Philadelphia that were either being remodeled or demolished or repurposed. And those two things, especially the relic project, the architectural stuff, got me thinking about how important photography is as a tool to preserve. Because, you know, I do a lot of commercial work in the preservation sector, and, you know, it's a fact that not everything can be saved. So when that happens, then photography is usually part of a mitigation package to preserve that building. So I wanted to get into a project where it was sort of a long-term creative investment. You know, it was something that that I could work on and off of for years. And I wanted to be able to just draw on my work along the landscape and my work of art, you know, focusing on architecture, and kind of take those elements and put them into something that I was really passionate about. And the railroad is really something that I've been fascinated with ever since I was a kid. It wasn't more so about the trains. It's always been sort of about where they go and what they connect and why they exist. You know, what was their purpose. And so when I started this project, I actually got a travel grant from the Center for Emerging Visual Artists, which is a fantastic Philadelphia-based program. That, you know, I was a fellow there for 2 years, and they offered alumni travel grants. So I went all the way to Pennsylvania from New Jersey with my travel grant, and I spent 18 months photographing the railroad, sort of on my own, with no real idea of what I wanted the project to look like, et cetera. So over the course of the last 10 years, that project has just sort of evolved significantly, and it's taken me into different fields of work. It's taken me into different realms of commercial projects with some of the clients that I've worked with. So, you know, those are all things that we can talk about later on. But, you know, really the project started out as kind of a, you know, an interest in the landscape. And I chose the Pennsylvania Railroad because it was chartered in 1846, but, you know, 40 years before that, well before that, there were trade paths, there were canal systems that also traveled that landscape. So that landscape was just rich with history. And it was about, you know, really sort of understanding those layers of history and kind of peeling them back, and, you know, at the same time making something contemporary with that interest of history.
And you chose to mainly use a 4x5 camera, which is a longer process, and using film. And Eric Williams asked, why did you choose monochrome instead of color? So can you talk about sort of your process shooting and your equipment, and why you use black and white?
Yeah, absolutely. So initially I started this project actually not in 4x5, but in 5x7. The camera that you see in the little quick time-lapse clip is a 5x7 camera. Oh. I liked 5x7 because of its aspect ratio. It you know, it lends itself to landscape work. And, you know, at the time I was pretty much, by the time I started this project, I wasn't making silver prints in the darkroom anymore. And the Imicon scanner, I learned that it could scan a 5x7 negative. So I'm like, okay, well, one, it's a bigger negative. Two, I can scan it with an Imicon, best of both worlds. It had the right aspect ratio, and I did shoot a lot of 4x5 as well. It was funny, like I used 4x5 of the stuff that I didn't really care about, which, I mean, looking back, I mean, 4x5 still, there's a ton of images in this project that are just as critical to some of the 5x7 ones that were shot on 4x5. But usually 5x7 was my mainstay format. And Eric, you asked about why black and white. For one, it just simplifies things. You know, the work is not about color. It's not about now. It's about sort of that play between, you know, the historic and the nostalgic and the contemporary. And by introducing color, I think it complicates the work in a way that I'm not really interested in going there. The other thing for me with black and white is you have control the entire process from start to finish. So, you know, some people might send their film out to be processed. I don't do that. I mean, I process my film down in my basement. It's a, you know, it's a little dungeon, but it works. And there's something about having control of the process from start to finish, you know, and then you scan that negative, and then now all of a sudden you have all this control in Photoshop. And, you know, I think it's worth noting that in the last maybe 6 years, this may be unpopular to some people, but I'm not, you know, shooting film much anymore. I started using digital, but I use this, I treat the digital camera the same way I treated a view camera. Obviously, it's got to be on a tripod. It's all about perspective control and focus control. And, you know, the digital camera is just a different tool. It gives me immediate feedback, and it allows me to take chances in ways that I could never do with the view camera. So I hope that answers your question, Eric.
So now that you use digital, sometimes is that how you make the time-lapse videos that we saw in the
Yeah, usually the time-lapse videos are usually just kind of for fun. I don't do it often. Sam Markey and I were talking about this the other day. We've been working on sort of a ongoing project down along the Delaware Bay in Cumberland and Salem counties, and you know, it's kind of a different way of thinking when you go out. It's, you know, digital is a little tricky because you now have this camera that can do all kinds of stuff, right? You can shoot video, you can do time lapse, you can shoot stills. And the way I work when I go into a day of making photographs, that's my mindset. You know, so a time lapse doesn't normally happen because when it takes long, you know, it can take 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, depending on what the situation is. So usually I'll you know, if I'm in a place where I'm kind of like hunkered down and I'm staying there for, excuse me, half the day, then I'll shoot a time lapse.
Oh, we got a couple of questions.
All right, so Brian, what? Let me see what you got here.
Do you want to answer one of those questions?
Yeah. So, so Brian, to answer your question about my experience sort of working with the locals, you know, it's been interesting. When I first started the project, I focused between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, and you know, that was the area that I knew the best. I've been traveling that landscape for 25 years, and you know, I was pretty familiar with it. I was pretty comfortable with it. I never really had to interact with locals, and when I did, it was always a great experience. I mean, you know, one of the towns that sticks out to me was Johnstown, which I visited several times. And Johnstown is like a photographer's dream. It's a sad place. It's a tough place, but the people are just incredibly proud, and they're always willing to ask, you know, answer questions and sort of engage you, and kind of welcome you in. So in that respect, it was good. When I kind of went as far west as I could and started working my way back during the travel grant. And when I got to Harrisburg, I realized that things were going to change because I had to work with Amtrak, and Amtrak has a much different feel. You know, they have a heavier law enforcement, and at least that was my perception. And so it took 1.5 years to make contact with somebody at Amtrak that could help me. And, you know, we basically worked it out that when they need work, like historic documentation work for this kind of mitigation stuff, I would provide them with images, and in exchange, you know, they would help me get access to different historical sites. And, you know, it was a fantastic relationship. It still is a fantastic relationship. and it allowed me to get into places and photograph things that, you know, normally I'd either get arrested or killed, because, you know, you're in a high-speed rail network and you don't, I mean, I've got 2 kids, I've got a family. I'm not going to trespass and do stupid stuff and put myself in danger, or put myself at risk for getting arrested. So working with Amtrak was phenomenal. And then I also, you know, that extended into Conrail and a couple other organizations as well that were instrumental in getting access. So, you know, short answer, I mean, you know, it took some work, but I found that, you know, people in the railroad industry are proud about what they do and the history of the landscape and the history and sort of legacy of transportation by rail. And if you sort of appeal to that sense, it goes a long way. It goes a really long way. So,
yeah, I think that's always a problem for us as photographers, like knowing when you should talk to someone before you shoot something, or even if you're taking a portrait or a
sure.
landscape on someone else's property, you're like always a little worried about that.
Yeah. It's funny. I worked with a guy a couple years ago in the Altoona area, and Altoona was kind of like the beating heart of the Pennsylvania Railroad. They had their shops there. They engineered and designed and tested everything in those shops. And you know, I had a recently retired employee take me up on the mountain and show me around, you know, on access roads that I would never even think of going on by myself. And after doing it, like, could you get away with it? Yeah, probably, but I can't work that way. I can't. Better to be open and transparent about the whole thing.
Yeah.
So
And I bet you hear all the stories from the people like, oh, I worked on this train for like 25 years. And
Yep. Yeah, a lot. And you know, again, that goes back to that whole sort of that tradition, where people are really proud about what they did. I mean, it's a big deal. You're operating a massive piece of infrastructure that that, you know, moves goods, moves hazardous materials, and you know, these people keep that going morning, noon, and night. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a 24-hour job, and the elements they're unforgiving. So so Vaughn, you where'd you go? How often do you revisit the same scene or place in different seasons? That's a great question. You know, there's a segment that I have been visiting over and over and over again. It's called the Middle. It was known as the Middle Division, which was basically from just west of Harrisburg to Altoona, Pennsylvania, where the railroad sort of hits the Allegheny Escarpment, and it follows the Juniata River, and that piece of landscape and that piece of railroad is by far one of the most beautiful places on earth, to me. And I've gone there in the dead of winter. I've gone there in the middle of summer, and it's different every time, and it's just beautiful either way. And I've also done that, you know, on the west slope from basically from Altoona to Johnstown. But more so on the Middle Division, mainly because, you know, if I wanted to grind out a day trip, I could get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be on the Middle Division by first light, and then I could photograph all day until I'm ready to collapse, and then just drive home. Getting past Altoona is a little trickier for me. It requires a much bigger sort of commitment. But yeah, I try often to change up the weather and to try to get out there in different seasons. Because if you're looking for certain things, like if I found out about some sort of facility or area that was, you know, abandoned but still intact, you're not going to find it in the summertime. It's completely overgrown. So you go back in the wintertime when it's everything's dead and the vegetation has died off, and you go back and start ferreting out what you're looking for.
Can you show us some of the images from that area you were talking about, or is that on your website?
Let's see here. So, let's whoops. I mean, the middle division is pretty much, you know, this kind of sums up the middle division. It's very rural. It's not real. I don't want to say it's remote because you're always within 40 miles of Penn State. But it's a really quiet and really beautiful place, and the river. Let me see if I can find a view of the Juniata. Well, I mean, this is the Susquehanna, but this is also part of it. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of how beautiful and how kind of grand the landscape is.
Yeah. Yeah, that looks like it could be in the 1800s. It's like still looks the same as some of the photographers that you mentioned that inspired you. I look at that picture and it looks like, wow, that could be like 200 years ago.
Sure.
So
Matt, you mentioned about ever considering drones for this kind of work. Yeah, I've considered it a lot. However, I've also considered the liability of it. And, you know, it kind of goes back to that idea of, you know, do I shoot time lapses all the time? It's working with a drone is a completely different, it's a different feel. And it's a different process. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, it kind of scares the crap out of me. It's not something that I would take lightly because one, you know, now you're kind of dealing with locals in a different, you know, sort of way. They might not be too keen of that. They might not be, you know, too happy that you're throwing a drone up on the shoulder of the road in front of their house. And, you know, they're not exactly quiet. They're not discreet. And, you know, when you roll up with Jersey plates and you're in the middle of nowhere, they're already kind of like, the hell is this guy doing? You know, fortunately with the railroad, there's a lot of people that go out there and photograph trains and stuff. So like, yeah, I just kind of play that route and they just kind of shake their head and then shake their head and walk away. But if you're putting a drone up, I don't know, that makes me a little nervous. If I could put a Canon 5DS on a drone and go buy it, I would. I mean, that's the other problem is I feel like, you know, for size and cost, I can't get what I need. You know, I didn't go to digital until the 5DS came along, which is at what, 52 megapixels or 51 megapixels. And at that point, it was like, okay, this can match a 5x7 negative. This will do it. And, you know, I feel like if I got that drone, I'd be taking a step backwards. And I don't, you know, if I was using a drone, I want those prints to be the size of a wall. I don't want them to be small. And I don't want that technological limitation telling me that now you can't do that. So maybe one day, you know, when I get big and famous and get a grant to put a Hasselblad camera on a six propeller drone, but not yet.
You can shoot from like a helicopter or something. That's pretty badass.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's badass. It's also incredibly expensive too. So
yeah,
I'm not a big fan of heights. So well, that's not true. I don't mind heights, but I'm not. I don't know. I like the idea
throwing it out there, you know.
Straight down. So that would be, you know, that would be pretty attractive with the drone.
Yeah.
So Matt, you had asked what will ultimately happen with this project. Will there be a book? Well, I sure as hell hope so. That is my goal. And David, you're asking the same thing. And David Frazee, who I had as a professor many moons ago, just recently published a book on the Mississippi River, which is one of a 3-part series, I believe. And you know, the idea of publishing is really important. The downfall of that is, you know, as a complete control freak, I want to make sure that it's right. You know, that the output and the printing is critical to me. You know, I sort of in school when I was a student and after school, I worked as a darkroom technician for Richard Kagan, who, you know, he's a dear friend of mine now, and he is a master printmaker in the darkroom. And, you know, I learned that the print is just as critical as the, you know, as the process of making the photograph. And in a book, I've seen so many books that are just amazing work, but they just blow it with the reproductions, and that scares the crap out of me. And you know, one of the things is, you know, the problem with that is it costs money. It costs a lot of money. Also, I don't feel like I'm done yet. You know, I feel like there's some stuff that still needs to be done, and some ideas that still kind of need to be worked out. But I mean, ultimately, the idea would be, you know, a book project of this work. And, you know, I've got a few irons in the fire and some stuff that, you know, might sort of pan out down the road. But right now I try to just, you know, do this kind of work and do this kind of talking about the work and getting it out there. Because eventually I think, you know, there's a lot of people that are interested in it. And I specifically kind of built this project to not just be a fine art project, to not just be railroad oriented. You know, I wanted to make it as accessible as possible, to sort of provoke ideas about the landscape and how we've sort of manipulated the landscape for over 200 years. And, you know, just use that sort of railroad as the conceptual piece that weaves us through it. So eventually we'll have a book. Can't tell you when, not sure yet. David, I'd love to talk to you more about it sometime, you know, to get, you know, get some ideas of how you went about it, because I've got some, but, you know, I'd like others. I'd like other options as well.
Yeah, and I think what you said about getting the work out there, like books to me have been the way I've learned a lot about new artists, and like people having art book fairs and the photo art book fair, and you know, everyone collects them now because you can't always afford to buy prints, so it's a cool way to share your work.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's funny, for years I always thought it needed to be this tome, you know, it needed to be like a 300-page volume with all these photographs, and I don't know if it needs to be that. You know, I went in the last year, I designed a website specifically for the Mainline project, because as you can imagine, after 10 years of doing this, I mean, there's a lot of work. I built it, I was ready to launch it, and then I just tore it all down. I just felt like it was a bad move to put all of it out there, and it just didn't feel right. So, you know, I'm kind of thinking about different, you know, edits and small books, and kind of, you know, keep people baited and do small catalogs and limited runs to kind of, you know, to kind of just keep it fresh, instead of, you know, going for that giant, you know, book project that it'll cost $50,000 to do.
Yeah, editing a book is totally different than, say, editing for an exhibit or your website or anything else.
And honestly, you know, I have a couple of really good friends that have done a lot of books. They did a lot of book design for Abrams and a couple other big publishing houses for photo books. And I would go to somebody like that and just be like, take it. Just you come up with the framework. We work together on it, and you know, this is what I want out of it. This is how I feel about it, and just run with it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've really enjoyed that sort of collaborative process with people that are you know, sort of that can think about the work objectively and are completely removed from my process.
Mm-hmm.
So Don, you mentioned some of the facilities that were torn down out in Western PA. Yes, in fact, that when I went up to Altoona a couple of years ago, I was giving a talk at the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art for a William Rowell symposium, and I was able to get up there a couple times to document what was left. I'm not 100% thrilled with what I got, but you know, usually I'm not. But I have them, and you know, unfortunately, that's the sort of gist of what survives now is get it now because it's going to be gone. And you know, that was part of the reason. That's part of the aspect of this project that doesn't always get seen, is that, you know, there are a lot of facilities that were built in the 20s and 30s that were critical to the operation of this railroad, and they're obsolete. It's just technology, it's progress. So, you know, it's important to document them when you can. So Jordan, only take 1 to 2 shots with digital. Do you find yourself shooting more? That's a good question. So Jordan, one of my former students, Jordan asked that when I shoot film, I would usually only shoot 1 or 2 sheets of film per scene. And you know, that was more of an economic decision, because sheet film costs about 5x7 sheet film costs about $4 a picture. So every time you fire a piece of film off, it's $4. So if you shoot 2, it's $8. You know, I would, in many times, and if I was in a place where the light was perfect and, you know, the landscape was looking really, really good, and I was in it, I would just shoot 1 frame so I could make twice as many pictures. I don't really, you know, when I first started shooting digital, I was shooting a little bit more than I would have liked to. But as I've gotten more used to that process and sort of realigned it, you know, because I mean, with digital, you get so excited because every time you click the shutter, it doesn't cost you anything. And you know, I mean, of course, the camera and the lenses and everything else, they cost you a ton. But now you're just using your investment. But you know, when I would get back to the hotel or get back home, and it's like sifting through all these files that I don't need, it's like, you know what, get what you need, make sure the focus is good, shoot a bracket. So if you need to recover any shadow or highlight information, you have them, and call it a day. There's no reason to shoot 20 or 30. I mean, because of my experience with the view camera, you know, focus placement, exposure, all that stuff is readily understood. So now it's just a matter of, you know, kind of calming down. You know, if I'm shooting handheld with an autofocus lens, yeah, I might shoot a couple more things, but that's rare. You know, that doesn't happen hardly at all. You know, if I go on a hike in a place that, you know, sort of includes the railroad, I'll throw the camera in the bag with me, and you know, it's that good and it's that sharp. But typically, no, when I'm out, I try to limit the amount of frames that I take of a given scene, just keep it down to what I need.
Well, yeah, also to branch off that, Brad Mall asked, how far have you gone in getting the photos in this series, meaning off the tracks? Like, have you gone on hikes? And he mentioned views in the main line, like the 1,000 Steps hike in Mount Union.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, this past year, I checked off a couple bucket lists. We during the whole COVID thing in June, we rented a cabin on the Juniata River in Ardenheim, Pennsylvania, which is just east of Huntington, and we knocked out. We did the 1,000 steps, or what is it? Is it 1,000 steps? I forget. They say it's 1,000, but it's like 1,200. We did the 1,000 steps trail, and then my wife and I went back in July, and we photographed from a lookout point. I think it's Hawk Overlook in Duncannon, that overlooks the confluence of the Juniata and Susquehanna rivers. And then also we did some hiking down near the Pinnacle Overlook to get a couple views down there. So I try to, it depends on what the gist of the trip is. There have been times where I've literally, like I said, get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I get out on the middle division at first light, and I just grind. It's just it's a derby day of just trying to cover as much ground as possible. And then there's other times where, fortunately my wife loves to hike, and I'm slowly getting her to really love that area. So, she's game for going back. So, if we get 2 photographs and we get a great hike out of it that leaves you completely exhausted at the end, I'm all about it. For me, it flips the process, because in the last 6 years, it's been derby days. It's been maybe 4 or 5 derby days a year where, I'll cover 40 locations in a day and then just collapse afterwards. Or cover 300 miles in a 2-day trip, like a 20-hour trip, which, in some ways it's fun, and it's really only possible because I'm shooting digital. I don't need the extra time to reload film holders and sit on some filthy bathroom floor in a hotel and, to load holders. But, so I try to get off the beaten path as much as possible. And I'd like to do a little more of looking at, old alignments and like the Muleshoe Curve and the Allegheny Portage Railroad, because they were really important parts of that infrastructure that are, they're now, well, they were obsolete pretty fast, and then they rebuilt it into a railroad and then subsequently abandoned it again.
Can you show us some more of your favorite images, or did you have a slideshow you wanted to show?
Yeah, I'll just go through some of the stuff on the website. So this is a great example. This was shot on the West Slope, which is the sort of the eastbound escarpment of the Allegheny Range, and it's a long, sustained climb. This was made with a digital camera. You could not make this with a film camera. It was a faster shutter speed. We pulled over on the side of the road. My buddy Anthony, who's traveled with me for years and is probably, my best critic for this work. Sometimes I feel like he knows the work better than I do. He was like, "Man, what the hell are you doing? You can't stop here. Like, this is dangerous." I'm like, "It'll only be a second." And as we went over the bridge, I saw the train coming up, and again, most of my photographs don't have trains in them, and it just worked, whereas this is a much more sort of traditional view. This is up on the Susquehanna near Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, at the Heiner View Overlook. We didn't hike this, Brad. We drove it, but again, it gives you a completely different perspective by being able to kind of get that elevated viewpoint and see how, the road and the railroad sort of weave their way through the physical landscape. Mm-hmm. Then, there's other things that are important to the project, like the canal prism. So along the Juniata River, a lot of the canal infrastructure still exists. And that's something that is important to me. we didn't really get into it yet, but William Rowell was probably one of the most important photographers initially that I looked at for inspiration. And Rowell was hired by the railroad in the 1890s to photograph the Pennsylvania Railroad as this sort of technological marvel in order to kind of lure people to come travel and experience the American landscape by train. And one of the things that Rowell did, which is a very sort of classical, painting, academic school painting thing to do, is reference history, right? So we got to reference history. We have to acknowledge the canals. We have to acknowledge places like that that sort of predate the railroad. And then, the Susquehanna River, which I feel like you can't go wrong with making a single picture anywhere on the Susquehanna. This was actually with a 4x5 several years back. And then this is the Dolphin Arrows. This is just above Rockville, Marysville, Pennsylvania. This is this is a digital capture, but again, like Katie said earlier, it's very reminiscent to 19th century work and its sort of formalist aesthetic and the way the picture's put together and the way it's sort of an idealized landscape. Before I get too far into this, what else we got? Sam, so Sam Markey, my dear friend and partner in crime for this video. What is the longest exposure you've made on this project? The longest exposure I made on this project was when we stood out at Rockville Bridge with a lot of beer and made a long time-lapse video at night. So Sam, that one goes to you. So Keith, yeah, this is definitely a incredible piece of railroad. It's funny that the Pennsylvania Railroad, when it was chartered, it was originally from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. And the reason why they did that is because the state's canal system was called the Main Line of Public Works. They had built a railroad basically that reached Columbia, which is below Harrisburg. And then another railroad was built to connect to Harrisburg. So they figured, all right, we'll build from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. And then, over time, and from 1846 to probably the up to the Civil War, they kept buying up other companies and consolidating to become what was known as the Pennsylvania Railroad. For all intents and purposes, my project really stops at the Ohio River. I had to draw the line somewhere. As much as I'd love to go all the way to St. Louis and all the way to Chicago and all the lines that crisscross in between, it's just not practical. And I think the Ohio River, these railroads were built to get to the Ohio River initially. That was the goal for westward trade. So, from sort of a traditional standpoint, that's where my work kind of stops. Weirton, Wheeling, Conway, and areas like that out on the Ohio River. But it's an incredible piece of railroad, and that's plenty of real estate to cover. That's why it's taken so damn long.
Mm-hmm. Someone else's, Brian's question was, any locations in PA you would love to shoot but have not been able to access?
There's always something. There is a place on west of Harrisburg, west of Johnstown, between Johnstown and maybe Latrobe or Blairsville. There's a location called the Pack Saddle Narrows. And, in the 1800s, when the Pennsylvania Railroad would hire these guys to go out and photograph the railroad as this sort of modern marvel, they always sent them to the Pack Saddle Narrows, the Jack's Narrows, and the Lewistown Narrows. And they were these really sort of dramatic pieces of landscape where, the railroad, the canal, and the river in Pack Saddle, it was the Conemaugh River, all get wedged through this really narrow, really dramatic pass. And, that for me is, that would be a place where I'd love to get to. It's pretty remote, and it's pretty treed in. So, that's when I'd have to bring in a drone. But, those are places like that are kind of have long been on the list.
Yeah, and on your website under field notes, I see you have like historical images along with some writing.
Yeah.
Um, some of these places look crazy. Like, how did they build this in the 1800s? But
Well, yeah.
even going there now, it looks.
And you know, this kind of ties into the idea of how the historical narratives inform my work. I mean, there was a line that was built across Lancaster County because, like I said, that when the railroad was built, it was built from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. So everything that was built east of that, Philadelphia, was kind of a mess. You know, they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of experience building railroads, and you know, the grades were problematic. So when the Pennsylvania Railroad started getting big, they basically cut a straight path from at Glen, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles east of, maybe more than that, east of Lancaster, and they cut straight across southern Lancaster County to the Susquehanna River, and that line is gone. It's a bike trail now. It's like the most over-engineered bike trail, you know, in the history of railroad bike trails. And so when I went out there to photograph it, I'm just looking at a dirt path. So to look at stuff like this, like in Salisbury, or you know, when they build these bridges, which, you know, these stone bridges, you can identify the Pennsylvania Railroad pretty much anywhere east of the Ohio River by stone bridges. They had a real sort of penchant for building these things, and you know, they were anywhere from 3 feet high to you know, just these massive bridges. So you know, when I can't wrap my head around how things were, then I go to, you know, I sort of default back to historic images. And I think, you know, like like at North Bend, you know, so this is in the Christiana, PA area. And, you know, this cut, when it was basically just finished, and then you can see, you know, this little trestle was built to build the A&S, which was that cutoff that they built at the turn of the century. And then later on, as the sort of landscape kind of took back some of the surroundings to now. And, you know, I don't specifically go out to create stuff like this, where it's sort of a before and after. I think that's kind of a heavy-handed approach, but sometimes it works. And by combining historical information, you know, just sort of factual information, with historic views and contemporary views, I think it gives viewers a wider context on, you know, what went into it. Because look, when we look at it now, it just looks like it's been there forever. But you know, the fact is that they spent a lot of energy and a lot of money to engineer these systems, you know, to make them work, and to make them super, you know, really efficient. So that's where Field Notes comes in. It kind of pulls together, you know, the idea of research, you know, scholarly research, and how to sort of draw on that to better tell the story, especially when there's something, you know, that doesn't give any context, like a weedy path.
Mm-hmm. And also, to go off that, like Vaughn asked, how much change have you seen in the railroad landscape since starting this project?
A
Have
lot.
you seen, you know, compared to the old pictures, and then just from you starting this project?
Yeah, I've seen a lot. It's kind of crazy how much has changed in just 10 years. You know, even on Amtrak, just the structures that we went out and photographed right off the bat, and then you know, what kind of came of it afterwards. It's pretty wild. You know, the railroad has been a constant state of change. You know, it's a vehicle. It's a means for transportation. And, you can be romantic about it. You can be nostalgic about it. But, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's going to evolve. People get upset about structures being torn down or, technology being replaced. And yeah, it kind of sucks, but it's just the nature of transportation. And then you can go to, somewhere like Jackson Arrows. Let me see if I can find this photograph. Where, in Jackson Arrows, the landscape, it's not in here. Sorry. The landscape and that railroad has been doing the same thing it was intended to do when it was completed in 1852. So there's some things that never change. That corridor is always going to be a vital corridor for transportation. There's some things, and sort of, the glut in the 1970s and 80s was all abandoned, stuff that wasn't making them money. And yeah, it's a shame. But it's just progress. I try not to have too much of a sort of romantic attachment to that stuff, because it doesn't really serve you any good. You're muted, Katie.
Sorry. It's also like when you're talking about the environment, though, like all these spaces are very close to rivers and probably spaces that are like fragile. So if somebody comes and destroys it, you can look back at these photos and be like, oh, what did we do wrong? Or like,
yeah,
part of history.
Well, one of the craziest examples, and I wish I had a visual to share. I lost my chat screen. Where the heck did I go? So one of the visuals, and again, this goes back to the Middle Division. I've just been enamored by the Juniata River. It's just such a striking landscape, and it's just kind of this sleepy, quiet, lazy river. And I was doing research down at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, who has a large collection of the Pennsylvania Railroad's historical documents and engineering stuff. And I saw this, I came across this folder, and it had all these notes and everything else. And I realized that the Juniata River that I know is a result of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I mean, they took out oxbows, they took out bends so they could straighten the railroad. But what we look at now, 100 years later, you would never know. You don't know the difference until you start really paying attention to those tiny little details in the landscape. And that's pretty amazing. In this day and age, with so much regulatory power and so much sort of environmental concern, you don't even think that was possible. But they did it. And there's definitely a concern about environmentalism and how that sort of impacts the landscape. But it's been a concern all along. Brad, that's a good note. Yeah, if I get some camo, I think I'll be all right. Especially during hunting season.
Oh yeah.
So Sydney, the best outcome I'd like to see for this project, honestly, this kind of back and forth is probably one of the most gratifying things, because you can present the work, and I've had multiple times where it's like, oh, it's about trains. No, it's not. It's not about trains. It's about the landscape. It's not about locomotives or rolling stock or who owns the railroad. I don't, the Pennsylvania Railroad is a fascinating subject for me historically, but this isn't about that. This is about the landscape. And to be able to talk about that is very gratifying. Obviously, the grand process, the grand result would be the book, and maybe, to have this work in a collection like the Library of Congress. That would be my dream. Museums, sure. Not sure about what museum would be a good fit, but you know, the Library of Congress, I want this work to be able to serve a greater good for sort of historical research and landscape studies and all that stuff that goes into, you know, how I handle this project. And then you had also asked, sorry, I'm giving Sydney priority. She's another one of my former students. Have you considered photographing any of the projects that are reclaiming railways? Yeah, so I mean that the A&S branch, the low grade across Lancaster County that I was talking about in that, you know, in those blog posts, that's been a part of my work professionally, and you know, to be able to document things that are being repurposed. I mean, you know, the High Line in New York and the Reading Viaduct in Philly are, you know, they're big, high-profile things, and I haven't really pierced into that realm per se. Not especially not in New York, but you know, I feel like they're well covered. My interest is actually to kind of focus on the lesser known ones. There was recently, I had a couple photographs featured on a panel at Jackson Arrows. The Allegheny Ridge Corporation was doing they were doing interpretive panels, historical panels at different sites along the Juniata River. And they reached out and they said, we really love your photograph of Jackson Arrows. You know, we wanted to put it next to William Rao's photograph. Would you be willing to do that? Hell yeah. I mean, you know, to have those photographs, you know, featured out in the landscape in the context of sort of preservation and interpretation, that's the best thing ever. You know, the High Line and the Reading Viaduct, they're well documented. I want to try to represent the ones that are not as documented. All right, Don, Jim Shaughnessy, deceased, published many photo books. Not landscape. I had a very brief, so Jim Shaughnessy, who is a really sort of prolific photographer, more so in the kind of railroad realm. You know, he was kind of always in the right place at the right time. Shaughnessy was an incredible photographer. He shot with a 4x5 press camera. And, you know, talk about a master of his craft to be able to work that fast on the fly with a handheld 4x5 camera is kind of mind blowing. And I did work with him a little bit when I curated the show up at the Monmouth Museum. We featured about a dozen pieces from his work from the Center for Railroad Photo and Art out in Madison, Wisconsin. And I was lucky enough to have maybe a 15 or 20 minute conversation with him on the phone, and we just clicked right away. I mean, what I was doing, he understood it. He understood why I was doing it, you know, and he was definitely, you know, he was on like David Plowden's level. He just understood the importance of sort of documenting and the sense of urgency that comes along with it. All right, what else we got here?
Yeah, actually, where else have you shown this work? Is it mostly historical preservation, you know, related places, or museums or galleries?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of everywhere. I mean, I've only shown it like not large chunks, because I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work. I've only shown it maybe a half dozen times. And, you know, at the most, maybe 12 or 18 pictures, which is like a good overview, gets you an idea. But the show that I curated up at the Monmouth Museum I think we had 20 photographers in that show. And the work spanned from, you know, basically from the Depression all the way to contemporary times. And that was pretty cool. I mean, it was a total gratuitous thing to put myself in there with all these people that I just absolutely admired and was enamored by, people that I had just even learned about. But you know, it was interesting to see it in that context. But I haven't really, you know, I don't specifically go out to show unless it feels right. You know, I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's kind of a hard thing to explain, but you know, I mean, like with Gravy, it's a nice environment. It's a good place. You know, when I showed up at Scranton, at the Camera Works Gallery, they were very supportive and very excited about the work. And you know, Scranton is kind of an appropriate place with all the railroad history up there, though it's not related to what I'm doing. It was a good place. But you know, I have shown a little bit of work at the Southern Alleghenies Art Museum when we did the Rouse Symposium. And then of course, you know, juried stuff. You have to get your work out there. You got to show your work, enter it in competition. So.
Let's see. Eric Williams says, I like how the project is more than just the immediate railroad landscape, that you included town views, interiors, etc. Did you see that way initially when you started, or did you expand your vision as the project started to define itself?
No, that was actually the way I started the project. I actually, so when I was a senior at Drexel, one of my first ideas in senior thesis was to photograph this, and it failed because of all the reasons that I understand now, I didn't understand then. You know, I was kind of literally holding on to the railroad tracks as that like thing that ties all the photographs together, and it didn't need to be that way. So when I, you know, after the Watershed Project and after the Relic Project, excuse me, I really went out to just use the railroad as my guide. And I was really interested in the towns. I mean, you know, my first trip, I went with Ben Riley, who, you know, was one of the founding partners of Gravy. Ben and I went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and we stayed in Johnstown, Pennsylvania for 3 days. I was just so blown away with the landscape there and completely ignored the railroad. And I did that, you know, for the first 4 or 5 trips. And I think that's what kind of laid the groundwork. And when I started getting more comfortable and I started looking more at the railroad and how it fits into that landscape, you know, it started to make sense. And in between those trips, I'd actually started going to the Library Company of Philadelphia to look at the rail work. Sarah Weatherwax was pulling prints for me, and you know, I was looking at, you know, even the index prints, which are just these little 8x10 contact prints or copy prints. And I started looking at how Raul was kind of dealing with the railroad in composition and in context. And I started drawing on the sort of, you know, the formal aspects of those photographs. And that helped me kind of, you know, integrate the railroad back into that collection of work. So, you know, in my statement, it says I have sort of 2, you know, distinct views, the landscape around the railroad and the view that the passenger would kind of experience. And I don't really hold on to those principles. Obviously, you know, it's not a checkbox when I go out there. It's like, well, it looks like a passenger's view, I'll take this picture, or, well, that's, you know, that's a landscape view. But, you know, those are kind of the 2 general frameworks that hold, you know, the container together without going too crazy.
Mm-hmm. Do you see it evolving as you do it for the next 5-10 years, or however you?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't feel like I'm done. I still get excited when I go out there. It still feels new. You know, this might be something I do for the rest of my life. I mean, I've made it fairly clear to my wife that, I want to die on the Juniata River, like when I'm old and gray. So, it's a place that's always going to be special to me. And it's always going to be a sort of beautiful landscape. And I don't know. I don't know how it's going to change. I might use a drone. I might do more video content and more sort of stuff to go along with it. Dare I say I might photograph a person or two? Probably not. It's that this project has gone so far without that I don't think it's, it would completely change the direction. But sometimes change leads you in another direction that is surprising. So that's always fun. Mm-hmm. So Nancy, you had asked how much Photoshop is necessary to prevent a modern feel. It's a good question. I feel like I did more Photoshop work when I was shooting film than when I started shooting digital. Film by nature it's dusty, it's scratchy. And, unfortunately, early on in the project, I would be so excited to process the film that I would process 5 to 10 sheets at a time. So the film got pretty, uneven development and it wasn't where I'd like it to be. So I actually did more work on the earlier stuff than I do now. I mean, Nancy, Richard Kagan, and one of the first things that Richard taught me when I was working in the darkroom with him was, when you work on a print, it's 2% here, it's 1% there, it's 3% there, and that all goes into the sum of it. And I treat everything the same way, like in the shared screen here in this view of the eastbound descending horseshoe curve, all that little intricacy in the snow and the sort of cross hatching of the trees, that's all bought up. I mean, that's all manipulated. So for me, I hate to say how much Photoshop work it is, this goes back to Richard Kagan, because when I first started printing digitally, he was just like terrified, and he was like, how much time do you spend on the file, like versus how much time you would spend on it in a darkroom? I'm like, well, who gives a shit? It doesn't matter. It's the end result. Like the thing is in the darkroom, you could spend 6 hours because at some point you have to go and eat or you have to go use the bathroom, and then you forget what you do, and then you're starting over again, right? This, you hit save, you walk away from it, you get something to eat, you come back, you pick up, there's all your layers, it tells you exactly where you are, and you continue on where you are. So, I just try to do what I can to keep the viewer in the photograph. All my students on this call, on this presentation, will all roll their eyes, but the first thing I do is look at the edges. Look at the edges, push the viewer into the middle of the picture, and then lead them around the picture. That's what I do with Photoshop. That's how I kind of keep, the process simple, and then keep it, as natural as possible. I don't want it to look modern. I want it to just look the way it should look. All right, so Don. Yeah, so Amtrak is making a lot of progress with the New York access, and yeah, I would love to be their project documentation team for a job like that. I mean, it would be like a 10-year, 12-year commitment, and of course I'd have to drag Sam Markey along with me. But it's the tough part about photographing up in the New York terminal area in Amtrak is security. After 9/11, they're real concerned, understandably, about the infrastructure, and plus all the press that they get. And, you know, every time a train breaks down, the tunnels are failing, and which, you know, they have a serious host of problems that need to be addressed. But, you know, that if somebody called me tomorrow and said, do you want to do the hair documentation on the Penn Station tunnels, I'd drop everything and run. I would do it in a heartbeat. I would do anything to walk that tunnel once. I mean, that would be incredible, just photographs.
Let's see. What's the next location you want to photograph from Sam?
All of them. I want to go back to everything. You know, one of my favorite spots is the Rockville Bridge. I don't know if I have. I probably should have a photograph of that. No, Rockville is not in my gallery of photographs.
How
Rockville,
many images have you taken total? I mean, this is just a selection.
Hundreds, probably thousands. I've got, at the office, I've got, I don't even know, you know, those binder boxes that Archival Methods makes. I have about 15 of those full negatives, plus, you know, a couple hard drives full of files. I try not to think about that part because I get so overwhelmed. But yeah, there's a lot out there. So Sam, you tell me what next location do you want to go to, and we'll go. So Barbara, just a few miles from a railroad bike trail near the Susquehanna, and I remember the train running through the area. Mardic Forge. Your images are beautiful and powerful. Thank you. I love the old photos in comparison. I also like your presentation portfolio.
Oh yeah, you sort of did make a book as you showed in the video.
Yeah.
The beginning.
Yeah, the portfolio, the portfolio that was shown in the video clip is kind of that's my standard presentation book. They're actually made by, originally they were made by Archival Methods. And then recently I found, so Archival Methods discontinued them, and Print File, of all people that make the negative sleeves, they made them. And I happened to see, like, on a B&H deal of the day that they were selling them for some ridiculous, they must have wanted to get rid of them. They were selling them for like $20 a piece. So I bought a dozen of them. And I have a shelf down in my studio of shrink wrapped portfolio cases.
Nice.
But so Barbara, to answer your question, do I have a preference of paper? Yes, I do. I use almost exclusively use Hahnemuhle German etching. And German etching is a really beautiful paper. It's a matte surface. You know, it's funny, and my wife can attest to this. When I started printing digitally, you know, this was maybe 2002, actually, probably 2001, maybe 2002. And I remember making these prints and bringing them home, and I'm staring at a silver print, I'm staring at a digital print. I'm just like, my mind's kind of blown, and my wife's just laughing at me. She's like, just do it. What the hell difference does it make? If you don't like it, you can go back to making silver prints. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But the thing that I loved about digital printmaking so much was it was different. You know, like if you use paper in the darkroom, like I used Ilford Warmtone, that was my go-to paper, and then I would selenium tone it and polytone it. That had a very specific look. It had a very specific feel and a very specific depth and contrast. And it was an analog print. It was unique. And the toning process gave it a sort of a spontaneous result every time. It was never the same thing. And I like that. That was fine. But with digital, now you can use all these different materials, you know, all these substrates that you can print on. And for me, German etching, it's a watercolor paper. It's a toothy rag paper, and it's matte, but the blacks are just beautifully rich and really, really amazing. And for me, that's my go-to paper. It doesn't look like a silver print. I don't want it to look like a silver print. It has its own feel and its own characteristic to it. And then in the portfolios with smaller prints, I'll use the Hahnemühle photo rag, just because it's a softer surface. And in small prints that dithered texture of the German etching is a little overwhelming, especially if the light's wrong. If it's raking across the paper, it just kind of creates this, this texture that's not favorable. So, and Derek, you asked if I had ever considered using glass plates like William Rao. Hell no. Rao was an incredible photographer and an incredible technician. And I am completely blown away by his craft and the way he handled things. The thing is, you have to remember, Rao was using glass plates, but they were factory coated. He wasn't coating them out in the field, right? By that time, most glass plates were factory coated. So you didn't have to deal with the emulsion and the coating issues. Yeah, would I like to get myself an 18 by 22 inch view camera just to play with? Yeah, that'd be amazing. But the fact is, I'd have to hand coat that stuff, and I'm not interested in that. It's just too much. I shot 8 by 10 for a long time, and it's a beautiful format. It's a giant negative, and it comes factory coated, and it's beautiful. That's close enough for me. And I've always kind of joked about this because, in Rao's commission in the 1890s, he built a panoramic camera. And he was one of the first documented photographers in the States to use nitrate-based film for that camera, because it was flexible, right? So he could wrap the negative basically inside the drum, so it had a traveling shutter. And, so I'm pretty sure if Rao was alive today, he wouldn't be shooting film. He'd probably laugh about going back to shooting glass plate negatives. He'd be using a phase, like a P100 phase back, and, the most modern tools, because he was a photographer in that time, and he was using the most modern sort of equipment and fittings and materials that he could. I'm amazed by people that do that kind of work, but it's not for me. My work's not about that part of the process. It's not about, whether it's silver or whether it's digital. It's about the image. It's not about how I got there.
Well, I think we should wrap this up with the most important question of all, which is, along your travels through Pennsylvania, where's the best barbecue and beer that you have?
Depends on when you were talking, because there was a lot of great beer places. Whenever we would pick a place to travel, we would usually pick it around, essentials, food and beer. Yeah. And of course, the hotel. And Johnstown Brewing Company was always one of my favorites. Unfortunately, they have closed. And the other one that was always a favorite was Stoud's Brewing Company, who just closed early this year, up in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And they were off the beaten path. They were usually like they were like the special treat on the trip home. We would jump off and go up to Stoud's and have a couple beers there, and it was nostalgic to me because that was the first craft beer place that I ever went to. I wasn't even old enough to drink. I didn't even care about it back then. But Stoud's was the first microbrewery in Pennsylvania, so they were my go-to. But there's a ton of them now. There's so many good ones. There's a bunch in Harrisburg. Barbecue. Woody's in Huntington is decent, but I'm picky about barbecue. So
yeah, make it yourself.
Vaughn, next location, Texas. Yeah, yeah, I would love to go to Texas. Vaughn, who just commented, is an incredible photographer and an educator in Texas, and his the photographs that he posts on his account on Instagram just make me so excited because those rural empty landscapes are just so beautiful. So yeah, you tell me when, Vaughn. We'll go to Texas, or we'll go tool around the Ohio River.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody coming. I feel bad we can't have an exhibit in person, but hopefully,
We will.
yeah, next year we will have one. We're planning on next September for the 2020 Photo Festival. And you can check out the 2020 Photo Festival website. There's a few more preview events that are coming up. One at Wanderlife Gallery in South Philly. And I also curated a show that's going up at Cherry Street Pier. And then we also have the World Cyanotype Day on the 26th. So we still have few things. Oh, and also there's a new gallery in Collingswood, New Jersey, called Big Day Film Collective, and there's a great show up there. That is a satellite event to the 2020 Fest. And just like to thank everybody for coming and for the Halide Project and Wanderlife Gallery for helping organize these events. And to Mike for talking for so long. Thank you.
It's a treat. Thank you for everybody for some great questions and for spending your evening with me. And if you want to go check out more of my work, please go to my website and drop me a note. There's a contact form at the bottom. I'd love to hear from you all. I really appreciate your support, and it's a real treat to be part of this. This is one of the places I haven't really shown this work is Philadelphia, and it couldn't be any more of a critical place to show. So, and thank you, Katie, for everything, and Sam Markey and Emma Stern and Justin Geller for all your help, Emma tonight, and Sam and Justin for helping get this video together, and Justin for putting the soundtrack together. It's a real treat to be around such talent.
Yes, and hopefully we'll see you all in person soon.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys.
Signing off.